There is a moment. You know this moment when a song finds you before you find it. You are not looking for anything. Maybe you were tired. Maybe you were just sitting still. And then a sound begins, and something inside you responds. Not a thought. Something older than thought. Your breath changes. Your body remembers something your mind has no word for. This is not imagination. This is not sentiment. This is something happening inside you, triggered by nothing more than vibrations moving through the air. No image, no story, just sound. And somehow, you feel. So tonight, let us ask the question that most people never think to ask. What is it about sound that reaches the parts of us that language never can? Long before music had a name, it had a purpose. Go back far enough. Before concert halls, before instruments made of polished wood and metal, before anyone thought to write a melody down, and you will find something surprising. Our earliest ancestors were already making sound together. Not randomly, deliberately. Archaeologists have found bone flutes in caves across Europe, some estimated to be over 40,000 years old. That means before humans built permanent shelters, before agriculture, before written language. Someone sat down and carved holes in the bone so that breath could move through it and create something beyond ordinary noise. That is not the behavior of a creature simply trying to survive. That is the behavior of a creature that needed something more. But what did they need? To understand this, we have to stop thinking about music the way we think about it today, as entertainment, as art, as something you choose to listen to. For early humans, sound was not decorative. It was functional in a way that went far deeper than we might expect. Think about what early human life actually looked like. Small groups moving through unfamiliar landscapes, surrounded by danger, dependent entirely on each other. In that world, the most critical thing was not strength or speed. It was cohesion, the ability of a group to move, feel, and act as one. And sound, it turns out, is one of the most powerful tools for creating that feeling. When people make rhythmic sound together, drumming, chanting, humming in unison, something happens in the body. Heartbeats begin to synchronize, breathing aligns. A quiet but powerful sense of we settles over the group. Researchers who study group behavior have observed this effect even today in communities that still practice traditional collective chanting and drumming. Early humans did not need a scientist to explain this to them. They felt it, and so they kept doing it. Sound was used around fire at night, not for performance but to hold the group together in the darkness. It was used before hunts, not to entertain, but to bring minds into alignment, to move individual fear into shared courage. It was woven into moments of loss and moments of celebration, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. Here is what is important to understand. The emotion came first. Long before music became something humans made consciously, the emotional response to rhythm and tone was already built into the body. It was not learned. It was inherited, passed down through generations of creatures for whom shared sound meant safety, belonging, survival. This is why a song can move you before your mind catches up. You are not just responding to art. You are responding to something ancient, a signal that your nervous system has been reading for tens of thousands of years. The feeling was never about the music. It was always about what the music meant to a creature that could not survive alone. At some point, something shifted. Sound stopped being purely instinctive and started becoming intentional. Humans were no longer just making noise together. They were beginning to shape it, to repeat certain patterns, to notice that some combinations of tone created tension, while others created release, that a faster rhythm made the body want to move, while a slower one pulled the mind inward toward stillness. This was not a sudden invention. It was a slow discovery happening across many cultures in many places over thousands of years. But the direction was always the same, from feeling toward form. As human communities grew larger and more complex, informal sound was no longer enough. A small group around a fire could hold itself together through simple rhythm and repetition. But larger communities, ones with hierarchies, rituals, seasonal cycles, collective memory to preserve, needed something more structured. Sound had to become a system, and so, gradually, it did. Scales began to emerge, organized sets of notes that a community agreed upon, consciously or not. Melody started to carry specific meaning. Certain rhythms became attached to certain occasions: birth, death, harvest, prayer. Music was no longer just a feeling shared in the moment. It was becoming a kind of language, one that could store meaning, pass it between people, and hold a community's emotional life in a form that could survive across generations. What is remarkable is how this happened independently across the world. Ancient Mesopotamian clay tablets, dating back nearly 3,400 years, contain what researchers believe to be the oldest written song ever recorded, complete with notation. In ancient China, musical theory was considered as serious as philosophy. In West Africa, the drum was not simply an instrument but a voice, capable of carrying messages between villages across distances that spoken language could not reach. These were not separate accidents. They were the same human impulse, expressing itself in different forms, the need to give structure to feeling, so that feeling could be shared reliably, repeatedly, across time. Consider what this meant for the individual inside these communities. A young person growing up in a culture with its own music was not just learning songs. They were absorbing an emotional map, learning which sounds meant grief, which meant celebration, which meant reverence, which meant danger. The music shaped how they expected to feel, and when. It gave their inner world a kind of grammar. There is something quietly extraordinary about that. Long before psychology had words for emotional regulation, music was already doing the work, teaching people how to move through grief without being destroyed by it, how to access courage before a moment of fear, how to feel joy fully and then return to ordinary life. Sound had become more than a signal between bodies. It had become the architecture of inner experience, a way of building, organizing, and sharing the emotional life of an entire people. And once music had that power, it was only a matter of time before others noticed. Not just communities, but those with something to gain from controlling what people feel. Here is something worth sitting with. If music has always been a direct path to human emotion, if it can move bodies, align heartbeats, dissolve fear, open grief, then it is not just a beautiful thing, it is also a powerful one. And powerful things rarely stay free for long. Throughout history, music was never simply left alone. It was watched, managed, shaped by those who understood what it could do to a crowd, to a belief system, to a sense of identity. In ancient Greece, Plato argued that certain musical modes should be restricted, not because they were unpleasant, but because they were too effective. He believed that music in the wrong mode could weaken the character of citizens, make them soft, distract them from virtue. The idea that sound could corrupt was taken seriously enough to become political philosophy. Rulers and religious institutions across centuries, from medieval Europe to imperial China to the early Islamic world, placed careful rules around what music was acceptable, what instruments were permitted, what rhythms were considered dangerous. They were not being irrational. They understood something real, that music bypasses the thinking mind and speaks directly to something underneath it. And anything that can do that can also be used. This is where the tension begins to surface, because music, by its original nature, belongs to no one. It rises from a group. It lives in the air between people. It leaves no object behind. A song sung around a fire is complete in the moment it is sung and gone the moment silence returns. There is no ownership in that, no control. But as civilization became more organized, that began to change. Music started to be commissioned, paid for, directed, shaped towards specific ends. Kings funded composers who wrote music that made power feel sacred and permanent. Religious institutions used carefully chosen sound to create experiences of awe and submission. The emotional power of music, which had once served the many, was being quietly redirected to serve the few. Think about what this means on the level of individual experience. When you sit inside a vast cathedral and the choir begins to sing, what you feel is real. The emotion is genuine, but the architecture of that experience, the acoustics, the harmony, the timing, the specific frequencies chosen, was designed, constructed, not to free you, but to guide you toward a particular feeling, a particular conclusion, a particular kind of surrender. The music still works, but it is no longer entirely yours. This is the hidden cost that most people never name. Not that music became beautiful, or complex, or technically sophisticated. All of that is genuine progress. The cost is something quieter. It is the slow separation between music as something that rises from human feeling and music as something that is applied to it. One direction is inside out. The other is outside in. And once that separation begins, it does not stop. It simply finds new forms in every era. New technologies, new economies, new systems for delivering carefully shaped sound directly into the most vulnerable parts of the human nervous system. The feeling remains. But the source of that feeling moves further and further from the person who is doing the feeling, and most of us never notice. Because the emotion is real, and real emotion we trust. At some point, music stopped being something you went to. It became something that followed you. This did not happen suddenly. It crept in slowly, the way most profound changes do, through convenience, through technology, through small decisions that each seemed entirely reasonable at the time. First the phonograph, then the radio, then the cassette, then the earphone tucked quietly into one ear while the world continued around you. Each step made music more accessible, and each step made it slightly more invisible. Today, music is everywhere. It plays in the background of the coffee shop where you sit and think. It fills the silence in elevators and waiting rooms. It runs beneath the dialogue of every film, guiding your emotions toward the response the director intended. Streaming platforms give you access to over 100 million songs at any moment, more music than any human being could listen to across 100 lifetimes. And yet, something strange has happened alongside all of this abundance. Many people report feeling less moved by music than they once did. Not because the music is worse, but because the listening has changed. Music that is always present becomes part of the furniture of life, noticed less, felt less, processed by the brain as background rather than signal. Researchers who study auditory perception have a term for this: habituation. The nervous system, designed to pay attention to change and novelty, gradually filters out what is constant. When music is everywhere, the brain learns, quietly and automatically, to treat it as noise. This is a remarkable reversal. For tens of thousands of years, music was rare. It required people to gather, to be present, to participate. The emotional power of music came partly from that rarity. The body recognized it as something significant, something worth opening for. Now music requires nothing from us. It asks only that we press play. Or sometimes, not even that. Think of the last time you truly listened to a piece of music. Not as a backdrop to something else, but as the only thing you were doing. No screen, no task, no half-divided attention. Just you and the sound. For many people, that kind of listening has become almost unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. The silence around music feels strange now. We have forgotten how to let it land. And underneath this shift is something worth naming clearly. The music industry, built on streaming numbers, algorithmic playlists, and the economics of attention, has a structural interest in keeping music flowing rather than meaningful. A song does not need to move you deeply. It needs to keep you from pressing skip. These are very different goals. One serves the listener, the other serves the platform. So the outside-in direction that began centuries ago, music shaped and delivered to produce a desired response, has now reached its most efficient form. Sound follows you from room to room, from morning to night, curated by systems that know your patterns better than you know them yourself. The emotion is still real. The response in the body is still genuine. But the space in which music once lived, the silence before it, the attention it required, the presence it demanded, that space has become very difficult to find. And without that space, something in the experience quietly goes missing. So we return to where we began. A sound starts. Something in you responds, not because you decided to, not because you understood anything, simply because you are human, and this is what humans do. They feel through sound, before thought, before language, before any of the systems we have built around music had any say in the matter. That response is yours. It has always been yours, and perhaps that is the most important thing to hold on to. After everything we have explored tonight, we have seen how music began not as art, but as survival. A way for fragile creatures to feel less alone in the dark. We have seen how it grew into language, into ritual, into the emotional architecture of entire civilizations. We have seen how its power made it a target, something to be shaped, controlled, directed by those who understood what it could do to the human heart. And we have seen how, in the modern world, that shaping has become so seamless, so constant, that most of us move through it without ever quite noticing. But here's what none of that changes. The original capacity, the thing that makes a frequency moving through air become an emotion moving through a body, that was never given to us by any institution, any industry, or any algorithm. It is older than all of them. It was built into us across tens of thousands of years of living together, needing each other, using sound to cross the distance between one interior world and another. What sound really is, when you follow it all the way down, is a bridge, not between notes, between people, between the self that sits alone inside its own experience and the larger human reality that surrounds it. When music moves you, it is not just a neurological event. It is a reminder, quiet, wordless, arriving before any thought can form, that you are not sealed off from the world, that you are porous, that something outside you can enter and change the quality of what is happening inside you. That is not a small thing. In a world that increasingly asks us to be efficient, productive, self-contained, that porousness feels almost radical. To be genuinely moved by something is to admit that you are not entirely in control, that the boundary between you and the world is thinner than you might prefer. Music has always known this about us, even when we forgot. And so the question to carry with you, not to answer tonight, but simply to hold, is this: when did you last let a piece of music truly arrive? Not as background, not as habit, but as something you turned toward, gave your full attention to, and allowed to do what sound has always been capable of doing to a human being. The capacity is still there. It never left. It is simply waiting, the way it has always waited, in the silence just before the first note begins. In that silence, something in you is already leaning forward, already listening, already ready to feel. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and stay curious.